able to lobby and defeat all of them. So we're really proud of that work. We're really proud of the work that we've done in securing the civil rights protections that exist today. And our goal is really quite simple. We want to work holistically to secure full equality for Florida's LGBTQ community. And when I say holistically, that means that we never stop fighting when we win a singular policy battle. We never stop fighting when people show up to the ballot box and we elect a champion, whether that's on local, state, or federal level of office. Instead, we know that our fight is never over until there is true equality for Florida's LGBTQ community and true justice for all people. So we're going to talk a little bit about what programs that means we're working on and how that relates to the broader fight here in the state of Florida. But overall, I thought it was important that you understand when we started, what we do, and how we fit in as a piece of the fight here in the state of Florida. So you've got some pictures on your screen. I want to take you back in time a little bit, and I appreciate Rick sharing a little earlier that he was a part of this fight back in the 90s as well. What you see here is the inception of Equality Florida, although the people in these pictures didn't know it at the time. Our executive director is pictured there on the bottom right. That's Nadine Smith. She was at the time a co-chair of the 1993 LGBT March on Washington. If you remember seeing it potentially in the news, or maybe you were even there, over 1 million people turned out and marched on the nation's capital, arguing that LGBT people should be treated with the same dignity and respect that all people are treated with. And keep in mind what the culture and environment and climate was for LGBTQ people at the time. This was a community that had been ravaged by the HIV and AIDS epidemic, that had had an entire generation of gay men and bisexual men wiped out as leaders in the highest levels of office ignored us, or worse, mocked us. And so the fact that we were rallying and gathering in Washington, D.C., and not just that, but meeting with some of these leaders in offices that we had never dreamt of, was a huge milestone for the community. You'll see the picture on the left there. That's actually Nadine. She's sort of hidden back there with her little short haircut. She now has really long dreadlocks, so you might not recognize her, but Nadine was a part of the contingency that met with then President Bill Clinton in the White House. They were the first group of LGBTQ people to have such a meeting, to sit there at such a powerful table and to share their stories and to talk about the needs of the LGBTQ community across the nation. You see there a picture of the march as well. It looks a lot like protests today. It actually looks a lot like a pride parade because, of course, pride was, and continues to be a protest to this day. So the truth is that Nadine knew it, all these folks knew it, progress was being made on LGBTQ issues. We were no longer the other that people thought we were. We were showing up in the media, we were showing up on the streets of Washington, D.C., and we were showing up in the White House. But unfortunately, progress wasn't being made everywhere. And progress certainly isn't on a straight line. It takes lots of zigzags and very frequently goes backward before it moves forward again. In Florida, things were brewing. In 1994, Jeb Bush was running for governor the first time. And I'm going to quote him here in an editorial he wrote at the time. He wrote, "We have enough special categories, enough victims, without creating even more. Sodomy should not be given the same protections as race and religion." Of course, then candidate Bush and future Governor Bush was talking about whether or not LGBTQ people deserved civil rights protections. And in his mind, and in the minds of so many other folks, especially in the conservative movement, we had enough special categories that people like me, people like potentially some of you on this call, didn't deserve the same rights and protections as those practicing their religion or those of a different race. So that's what was going on back home in the state of Florida. And because of that, Nadine understood that the work of the states and the work in localities, the work in her hometown of St. Petersburg was going to be more important than ever. So she came back to Florida. She felt buoyed by the 1993 March on Washington. and she launched Equality Florida. And the goal was simply to fight for any scrap or shred of civil rights protections that she could gather for this community. By 1998, Jeb Bush was elected to the governor's mansion, and the state began to lurch to the right. LGBTQ people were in more danger than potentially we had ever been. And Nadine knew that that fight for civil rights protections was going to be waged, not just in Florida, but in states across the country. And she was hoping that we could lead the way. Well, she wasn't wrong, because one of the very first fights that Equality Florida and others had to wage was the fight for marriage equality. In 2008, so think about about 10 years after the piece of history that I was just sharing with Governor Bush, 2008, Barack Obama was elected president. And I think lots of folks know where they were when they heard the news that the country had elected the first Black president. I know exactly where I was. I had signed a contract with Disney. And so I was there in my tiny little studio apartment, banging pots and pans together, popping champagne. I was not old enough to drink, but don't tell my parents, because it felt like the country was really moving forward. But in that same year, in 2008, Florida passed an amendment to the Constitution banning same-sex marriage, saying that marriage was a right afforded only to one man and one woman. And as you know, with most constitutional amendments that are on the ballot, it takes a lot of support to get it over the finish line. And this amendment was no different. The amendment to ban same-sex marriage passed with 62% of the vote in Florida. And so I know many of you on this call know what it feels like to understand that your neighbors, your colleagues, your coworkers, your friends, potentially even your family, might have been among those folks voting to determine that your right to marry the one you love was not enshrined in the same way as it was for others. So Florida immediately became one of the epicenters for the battle for marriage equality. In 2013, so 5 years after the ban, Equality Florida launched the Get Engaged campaign. Now, remember, I told you that my job every single day is to help LGBTQ people tell their stories. Well, that was at the core of the Get Engaged campaign in 2013. Equality Florida wanted to lift up the stories of LGBTQ couples in the state of Florida. We wanted to not allow our neighbors to see us as other anymore, but instead to put our love, the same love that everybody else experiences, front and center. To say, this is what love looks like. It doesn't matter if it's two men, if it's two women, or if it's a heterosexual couple. That love is love. And so we launched the Get Engaged campaign in 2013. And less than a year later, in the year 2014, Equality Florida joined the National Center for Lesbian Rights, and 6 same-sex couples, including, you'll see 2 couples there on the screen kissing and celebrating. Equality Florida joined those folks in suing the state of Florida over the ban on same-sex marriage. We took the fight to the court system. On July 25th of that same year, in 2014, a judge in Miami ruled that Florida's ban on same-sex marriage was unconstitutional. And at every step of the way, that ruling continued to be upheld. And then, of course, we all know it was huge headline news, and I've included South Florida Gay News' headline here for you. In 2015, on June 26th, the Supreme Court, by a vote of 5-4, upheld that and other decisions in saying that bans on same-sex marriage were, in fact, unconstitutional, and that marriage equality would be the law of the land. That fight for marriage equality was central to who Equality Florida is and was. It was central to the fight for LGBTQ civil rights in the state of Florida, not just because people like Todd and Jeff, who are in this picture, not just because they could get married, but because in the process, we once again told our stories. We lived authentically and unapologetically. LGBTQ people were on the cover of newspapers across the state of Florida. Our faces, our love, our lives were being covered like never before. And that was a win. Beyond just marriage equality, it was a win for LGBTQ people at large. And I'll be honest, I think in 2015, that summer, when we celebrated marriage equality, when we had champions in the White House who were talking about our right to live authentically and openly, I think sometimes some of us fell asleep at the wheel. I know I got complacent. I was certainly young. And so for me, this was the world that I knew, a world that accepted me for who I was, a world that understood that my love was just as valuable, just as welcome, and just as appreciated as anyone else's. But then that changed. On June 12th of 2016, in the very early hours, I did the most ordinary thing in my life. I met up with my best friends, Drew and Juan. We got in an Uber and we went to Pulse nightclub. You know, the term safe space is sort of used online by trolls to make fun of people who aren't tough enough to take on the challenges of the world. Oh, you need a safe space, they always say in the Twitter responses. But for LGBTQ people, safe spaces aren't a joke. They're the lifelines that we carve out into the communities to be ourselves. Safe spaces are the places where we can hold the hands of the ones that we love without looking over our shoulders first. They're the places where we could steal a kiss without fearing that someone might hurl a homophobic slur in our direction. They're the nightclubs and bars and centers that we created for ourselves because the spaces that were safe for other people weren't safe for us. Churches weren't safe when I was growing up. Schools weren't safe when I was growing up. The places like Pulse, those were safe. I could wear my skinniest pair of jeans and nobody would look at me twice. And on June 12th of 2016, until 2 o'clock in the morning, it was the safest of places. I remember just an hour before things went south, standing on the patio with my best friends, Drew and Juan. And Drew had a master's degree in clinical psychology. And so when he would have a drink or two, he would give you these free therapy sessions, life lessons, he called them. And we stood there on the patio under the stars, and he gave a life lesson on love and compassion. He talked about how desperately he wished the world would get over the little stuff and see each other as people first. And he said, you know what I wish we did more often is tell each other that we love each other. Just after 2 o'clock in the morning, I stepped into a bathroom to wash my hands and I heard gunshots. I remember it like it was yesterday. I remember the feeling of panic, the sprint for an exit, this sliver of light in the back of the club that I had never seen from a door that I didn't even know opened. I remember bursting out into the parking lot and thinking, I can't believe I'm still here. Running through that dark club with gunfire in the background, I had told myself that I was going to die and that I would never get an opportunity to say goodbye to my parents. But there I was. I'd made it. I had survived. And to be LGBTQ in America means surviving every single day, despite the fear and hatred and bigotry we face. The 49 people weren't so lucky. 49 mostly LGBTQ people of color were murdered that night when a man charged in the front door armed with a weapon of war and fired nearly 200 rounds into the club. 13 of those rounds hit Drew and Juan and killed them both. I think Pulse was a wake-up call for a lot of people. That the fight for equality was never just about marriage. It was never just about visibility. It was always about ensuring we fought for a world where moments like Pulse couldn't happen anymore. It was always about demanding a world where LGBTQ people don't have to carve out secret safe spaces anymore, because we can be safe in the spaces where other people are. Equality Florida had done an incredible amount of work and continues to until that point. Remember, at that point, Equality Florida had defeated every piece of anti-LGBTQ legislation that had come through Tallahassee. They'd won huge victories in the battle for marriage equality. They'd ushered in new local LGBTQ protections for over 60% of Florida's population. But the question was, where do we go from here? In a world where we can notch legislative wins all the time, what do we fight for? How do we continue to push the needle further to ensure that LGBTQ people don't have to fear this kind of violence every day they walk outside the door? We understood that we couldn't just focus on passing legislation, that was a piece of the puzzle. But we understood that we also had to do the work of rooting out hatred and bigotry in the places that it showed up. So the question remains, what is left in the fight for LGBTQ equality here in the state of Florida, and really the country at large? Well, there are several areas to tackle. The first and largest and most urgent is the need for non-discrimination protections. We won a huge decision last summer, in fact, in the Supreme Court. And it wasn't close, by the way. Remember what the Supreme Court looks like. I want to lay that as the groundwork. This is a Supreme Court that has been stacked to the right. This is a Supreme Court that we were really worried would erode the kind of civil rights protections that we had fought for so long. This is a Supreme Court where nominees had talked openly about the decision around marriage equality being a, quote, mistake only the court could solve. We were bracing for impact. But last summer, in a 6-3 decision, including a remarkable statement by Justice Gorsuch, who said transgender people deserve civil rights protections as well, the Supreme Court decided that under the Civil Rights Act, the non-discrimination protections on the basis of sex include sexual orientation and gender identity. So in essence, they said, if you can't fire someone just for being female, you certainly can't fire someone for being gay or transgender either. And that extended beyond just workplace protections. It extended to housing and public accommodations and beyond. The problem with a Supreme Court decision is that it's really not finite, and it's up for a lot of interpretation. So we assume that conservatives who don't believe in non-discrimination protections for the LGBTQ community will be back with lawsuits. That's also why last week's executive order is so critically important. Last week, President Joe Biden signed an executive order that was the greatest expansion of LGBTQ non-discrimination protections in our nation's history. Essentially, what he did was say, all right, listen, every federal agency, if you're hearing me now, you must implement the decision from the Supreme Court right now. And not just in your own agency, but in all of the pieces of the country that you touch. That means Title IX protections in schools. That means protections against discrimination in credit and lending. It means protection from discrimination in housing. It means protection from discrimination in healthcare and hospital settings if they receive federal funding at all. So it's a broad-reaching executive order. But again, there's a caveat here. What President Biden can do with a stroke of a pen, future President, I don't know, Donald Trump Jr. could undo with another stroke of a pen. So that's the rub, right? Civil rights protections for people like you and I shouldn't be decided based on who's sitting behind the desk at the Oval Office. They shouldn't be up to the whims of Justice Gorsuch or what he ate for breakfast that day. Civil rights protections should be codified into law. They should be the law of the land. So that's been one of the singular most important fights for equality Florida. On the national level, we need to pass the Equality Act. The Equality Act would update civil rights law to include sexual orientation and gender identity. That's a huge priority right now. Here in the state of Florida, we've got a comparable bill. Remember, our goal is to codify protections on every level so that one person or one party or one angry caucus in Congress can't overturn the whole thing. So here in the state of Florida, we need to pass the Florida Competitive Workforce Act, and I'm going to get to that in just a second. We also need to end conversion therapy. Conversion therapy is the dangerous practice of mental health professionals essentially emotionally abusing a child into believing that they can change their sexual orientation or gender identity. It's cruel, it's inhumane, it is child abuse, and it is really important that we tackle it and end it forever. So we need a national ban on conversion therapy. We need a statewide ban on conversion therapy as well. And we need to continue to fight for local bans on conversion therapy, like the one that Alachua County currently has. We need to eradicate HIV and AIDS. HIV and AIDS continue to disproportionately impact the LGBTQ community, and specifically the Black LGBTQ community. We can do that if we get the right dollars into the right places and if we rework the law. Today in the state of Florida, if someone is living with HIV, they're on their medication, they are undetectable, which means scientifically they cannot transmit the virus to their partner. If that person living with HIV, even though they cannot scientifically transmit the virus to their partner, does not disclose their HIV status to their partner, they can be charged with a felony and face 25 years in prison. So what does that do? Does it discourage people from not sharing their status? Does it encourage people having open dialogues? Of course not. All it does is encourage people not to get tested so that they don't know their status, so they don't have to disclose it. All it does is perpetuate stigma that continues to make Florida, and namely Miami and Orlando, the #1 places in the country for new HIV transmissions. So we've got a lot of work to do around HIV and AIDS. We've got to protect transgender people as well. Florida, for multiple years, has led the country in the murders of Black trans women. We need to take on the violence against transgender people. We need to do more things like we just saw a couple of hours ago when President Biden rolled back the ban on transgender military service members serving their country. We need to ensure that transgender people, just like everyone else in the country, are afforded the basic civil rights they deserve. And of course, as I mentioned, in the aftermath of Pulse, we zeroed in on needing to uproot hatred and bigotry where it starts. And that's in schools. We know that LGBTQ young people are disproportionately affected by discrimination and depression and violence. We know that LGBTQ young people are at more risk of suicidality and attempting to take their own lives. But we also know that the presence of gay-straight alliances, the presence of a space, a safe space to be themselves in school, actually cuts the LGBTQ teen suicide attempt rate in half. So we've got work to do around safe and healthy schools. These are the areas that we've got to focus on here in the state of Florida to turn the tide for the rest of the country. I want to dive in just a little bit into a couple of things that I mentioned. The first one is the Florida Competitive Workforce Act. It's really simple, people. We're not asking for the world. We're not even asking for lawmakers to do a ton of work. We're asking them to add 4 words to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. 4 words, that's it. And that is sexual orientation and gender identity. That's all we need. All we need is for lawmakers in the state of Florida to say out loud that LGBTQ people as a marginalized population deserve protection from discrimination. So what would that do? Well, it would do all the things that I mentioned before. It would protect against discrimination in housing. It would mean that a transgender person who goes to rent an apartment couldn't be denied their application because their landlord was a little uncomfortable with their gender identity. It would mean protection from discrimination in employment, which means that although it's legal for me to get married on Friday, Now I could go to work on Monday and put a picture of our wedding on my desk and not fear being fired because my boss is uncomfortable with me having a husband. And it would mean protection from discrimination in public accommodations so that people moving throughout the world can just be themselves. They don't have to hide. They don't have to pick which places they're welcome at. They have access to public accommodations just like everyone else. And you know the exciting part? I'm going to tell you the exciting part. It's that the Florida Competitive Workforce Act is already ready to pass. Yes, you heard me. It is ready to pass. If it got to the floor today and got a vote, it would pass. How do I know that? Because last year, in the last legislative session, the Florida Competitive Workforce Act was the most co-sponsored piece of legislation in the Florida legislature. It had the most co-sponsors of any bill that was proposed. It has broad bipartisan support. In fact, 71% of Floridians support non-discrimination protections for the LGBTQ community. So you're probably thinking, after I shared all of that, well, why the heck hasn't it passed? If everybody wants it to pass and there are the votes to get it done, then why hasn't it passed? Well, there's the rub once again. Republican leadership in the legislature has decided that it's not worth taking up, that they don't serve to be held accountable for not moving on non-discrimination protections. And so they do nothing. The bill gets no hearing. It never gets to the floor for a vote. So when we talk about what we can do, which is coming up, we're going to talk about how we can engage on bills like the Florida Competitive Workforce Act to put some pressure on them to finally get these things over the hump. The other priorities here in the state of Florida, as I mentioned, a statewide ban on conversion therapy. That bill has also been filed. We need HIV modernization, which means we need to fix the law that sends people to prison for 25 years for not disclosing their status. We need to treat HIV like any other sexually transmitted disease. We need to remove the stigma. We need to stop jailing people for living with HIV and instead give them the resources and finances and research that they deserve so that we can finally eradicate this disease. There is no reason that in the third largest state in the union, we continue to lead the nation in new transmissions of HIV. The only explanation is that leaders we've had, including then Governor Rick Scott, who turned away millions of dollars in funding for HIV and AIDS research. The only explanation is that they have stood in the way of progress. So it's time to fix that. It's time to modernize our HIV laws. We need an updated hate crimes law that includes gender identity so that transgender people can be protected from hate crimes and have better access to legal recourse when they are the victims of hate crimes. And we need statewide LGBTQ inclusive school environments. So that means we need to continue the work of Equality Florida's Safe and Healthy Schools program that's doing work in 65 of 67 school districts. And we need to have curriculum that includes LGBTQ people. We need people dedicated to the mental and physical well-being of LGBTQ young people in schools, like we have here in Orange County. Those are the things that are priorities here in the state of Florida. So finally, I want to talk about how we do it, because I've shared a lot of information about a lot of fights and a lot of things left on our plate. And folks on the line might be either tuned out because, wow, that was a lot, too much for me, or they might be thinking, gosh, I don't even know where we start. There's a plate that's overflowing. Where do we even start? Well, I'll tell you how we start. We start on calls like this one. We start by building coalitions with organizations and groups and people within our communities that have a shared set of values. We start by talking to faith-based organizations that believe in basic equality for the LGBTQ community. We start by talking to law enforcement agencies about the need for better resources on how they can better respect transgender victims of crime. It starts by talking to schools and school boards and superintendents who want LGBTQ inclusive school environments. It starts by talking to business leaders who know that opening their doors and telling people that they're a business that's open to the LGBTQ community is good for business, that they will make more money if they're truly open to all. So we start by building those coalitions, telling them about these priorities. telling them what our fight is really about. I told you already, we have to tell our stories. I tell the story of Pulse frequently, not because it's easy to do, not because I enjoy telling it, I get some joy out of sharing it, but because it's necessary. Because people need to know about the lives of the people that were lost that night in order to understand the gravity of the level of hate and bigotry that existed in that club. All of us have to tell our stories. All of us have to share our lived experiences so that we can put a human face to the struggle we are facing in the state of Florida and beyond. We got to fight for representation. That means we have to elect champions on every level of government. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, and I probably should be, talking to my fellow millennials about the need to better fight for representation. But the truth is that we've got to fight for people at the ballot box that care about these things. And they exist on every level: city council, county commission, state legislature, and yes, even president of the United States. Elections have consequences. We've seen it just in the last 4 years, and we've even seen it just in the last 4 days, how people in every level of government can impact the way we live our lives. If we have representation in Tallahassee, we can get bills over the finish line. We have the largest LGBTQ caucus in Tallahassee we've ever had. This last election cycle, we elected the very first out Black lesbian to the state legislature. We elected the very first openly LGBTQ state senator. These are huge wins that allow us to get our priorities to the finish line. So once we've done all of those things, we got to organize. And again, I'm preaching to the choir, but we got to show up. We have to organize and show up. We've got to be relentless. We've got to show up. It cannot simply be, we elected you and now we expect you to do the things that you've promised. And you know that better than anyone. We have to continue to show up and organize and demand that these things be top priorities. There's a lot of work to get done in this country. There's a lot of work to get done here in the state of Florida, but we have to ensure that our lawmakers, our leaders know that LGBTQ civil rights cannot wait, that these protections cannot be put on the back burner, that they have to be a top priority. And the only way we ensure they know that is by organizing these coalitions we've built, by showing up and continuing to tell our stories and demanding that our leaders show up for us as well. So I'll leave you with this quote from the great Harvey Milk. And that is that it takes no compromise to give people their rights. It takes no money to respect the individual. It takes no political deal to give people freedom. It takes no survey to remove repression. All of these things that we've talked about today, all they take is people power, and they're possible if we gather together in our communities and get it done.
Well, thanks so much, Brandon, for an eloquent and persuasive presentation. We're open for comments or questions. First question is from Anne Marie.
Hi, Mr. Wolf. Thank you for an excellent presentation. I don't think I've heard such a tight, organized, and articulate presentation in a long time, especially on this subject. And thank you for sharing your story. I don't have a story myself much to tell, except that I think my daughter is gay, even though she's never told me this. In 2016 in Orlando, when she was at UCF, she told me over the texting in the Sunday on February of 2016, I was not at that nightclub. And I think that was a clue. And then last year she got married to a woman here in Gainesville, and they're now living in San Francisco. She asked me a question though. Yeah, it's great. Something that we could not have imagined years before ever happening in Florida, that she could get. Right. Yeah, and through the drive-through too. That was another thing we couldn't have figured. But that's
you said it was last year?
Yeah.
So it was like the COVID drive-through wedding.
It was absolutely, yeah. But, you know, the fact that they could get married. Well, so they're living in San Francisco for job reasons. And she asked me a question I couldn't answer. And she said, well, first of all, why do you think Obergefell made it through the courts? And I said, I thought that culturally, at least this was my hope, that everybody knew one. This is unlike race, unfortunately, where there are a lot of white people who don't know Black people and want to demonize them. But in the case of gay people, I think a lot of people have had that experience, and many in their own family. The question, though, was, is it going to be overturned? And I think what the target is looking at this on a state-by-state level if you can't do it on a federal level. And I think the forces are out there. And I wondered what you thought of that.
Yeah. I think the answer is it's possible, and that's just being honest and truthful with people that there have been some really concerning statements that have come out from sitting Supreme Court justices. It's extremely concerning that people who are on the court right now would be questioning past precedent, that would be questioning whether Obergefell was the right decision to make. That for me is a huge red flag that, there's the potential that they're looking at Obergefell as something that maybe was a mistake or was too far reaching, or they need to go back and revisit. And I think you can be sure that there are conservative forces out there that are attempting to put together the playbook for what a challenge to marriage equality would look like. But I will say this, I've been really inspired by the court. I never thought I would say that in the last year, when I was nervous before. I mean, the fact that Neil Gorsuch, in his opinion on Bostock, said out loud, transgender people deserve civil rights protections. I mean, that's a really big deal. So I think the court for me right now is maybe not as scary as I thought it was going to be. I'm knocking on wood when I say that, because they've also been really bad on other things, so they're not great. But on LGBTQ issues, they haven't been as disastrous as quickly as I thought they would be. And I don't know if I'm the Supreme Court today, and especially Chief Justice Roberts, if I have an appetite for taking on marriage equality when it's very clearly precedent, when there are millions of people who've already exercised that right, that would suddenly have the right taken away from them, when it's overwhelmingly popular in the US. I don't know that the appetite is there to take on a case like that. I wouldn't be surprised to see them refuse to take something on like that. So I'm not a prognosticator. I'm not an expert on the Supreme Court, but I would say today, there's the potential. And I know that there's conservative groups out there that would love to challenge the marriage equality ruling, but at the end of the day, I think it's probably unlikely.
Thanks, Brandon. Shirley? Go ahead.
Nope.
Shirley? Go ahead.
Rick?
Brandon, you
Oh,
are
hey.
a
Hi,
wonderful
Shirley.
speaker. Hello, hello.
Thank you.
A wonderful presentation. I have two questions.
Sure.
Do you have a website or a way for parents, extended family, to talk to children who have sexual identity questions and problems? How do our older generations get to see that in the light of how it's developing with children and be helpful? Do you have
Sure.
anything like that?
Yeah, I will. I'll try to get this link into the chat, and I can get it to Rick as well, for our transgender equality program area. We've got a wonderful trans woman named Gina who leads that work. And she does a lot of work with connecting folks in the community. She's got, I think she's up to 250 trans advocates, many of whom are young people, that help get people connected back into the community. And then the other group that I think we often work with is, of course, PFLAG. And they've done a lot of very specific work with the parents of LGBTQ young people and helping them along this journey. Obviously, the transgender and non-binary community is really a new one for a lot of people. We're still really learning what it means to live as a transgender American, and specifically as a transgender young person. And so for that reason, there's a lot of education that has to happen. But again, I think Gina has done a really incredible job with that. So I'd be happy to drop that information in here for you. And I think her email's on there too. So if you want to connect further, she's the guru.
I think it'd be very important, because the younger the child is that has these kind of identity disturbances in their thinking as to how they should be, there should be some guidance as to how to make it permissive to talk about it and things like that. And the second question is, do you all take donations?
We do, yes. Yeah, you can find us at eqfl.org. And we thank you so much for your support, of course. All of the dollars that are coming through are going back to our program areas, and specifically the Safe and Healthy Schools program is our largest one. So
Would you put that in the chat too?
yeah, I would love to, absolutely.
Great, thank you so much. I have a general question, and with the new executive order from Biden dealing with expanding the interpretation of discrimination to include sexual orientation and gender identity, that's going to be implemented by all government agencies. And I was wondering what the effect might be on Florida.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the effects are pretty broad reaching. Consider that public schools take federal funding. So every school that is touched by federal funding now would fall under that purview. And that includes Title IX protections, right? So that's about gender equity and things like sports and extracurricular activities. So all of those schools that receive federal funding would be impacted by non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people. The same goes with housing. So anytime there's federal funding in a housing program, that housing program would have to adhere to the Bostock decision around non-discrimination protections. And in order to keep receiving that funding, they would have to make good on that promise around non-discrimination protections. Other ways it could impact Florida is the healthcare system. So as I mentioned, healthcare agencies and hospitals that receive federal funding are also impacted by this executive order. So those hospitals and healthcare agencies and health insurance companies that receive federal subsidies have to adhere to the non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people. Same is true of credit and lending. So if those creditors or lenders are receiving any federal support at all, they also fall under the purview of that executive order. So as you can see, when you start going down the litany of places that the federal government touches, whether it's contractors, health insurance agencies through the Affordable Care Act, hospitals, schools, you can see why the executive order is so broad reaching. And it's not just, I think what's important about the executive order that impacts Florida is the executive order didn't just say, okay, when you're hiring to federal agencies, make sure you don't discriminate against people. It said everywhere this agency touches, sort of like the Lion King, it's like everything the light touches is yours. The same thing is true with these federal agencies. Everywhere you touch, that needs to be implemented, and you need to hold those people accountable to this executive order and this Supreme Court decision as well. So it'll have really broad reaching impacts here in the state of Florida. And in my view, it should also put some urgency behind passing the Florida Competitive Workforce Act in Tallahassee, because it's the cover that these Republican leaders need. They're not the ones who invented these protections. They're not even the ones who implemented them first. The Supreme Court did that, the federal government has done it, and now they would just be codifying those protections into state law. So it's made their job easier. And if I'm the Republican Speaker of the House, I really don't have an excuse anymore not to move on this.
Great, thanks. Anne-Marie, go ahead.
Yeah, this is really a follow-up to my earlier question, and that is about Obergefell and same-sex marriage. And that is that despite what the Supreme Court has done in terms of consolidating that California case, what individuals are concerned about is the fact that there may be still such, I guess, opprobrium against same-sex marriage that they'll try to fight this on a state-by-state level. And I'm wondering if you know of any examples where this may have started or where this has been threatened in a meaningful way, because I think that's most likely what's going to happen, is not a national law that is talked about as being overturnable in future, but on a state by state level. And of course, Florida would not be immune from such a process. So I'm wondering if you know anything there.
Yeah, so I don't know of any concerted efforts right now that are happening to repeal the marriage equality decision. I would say, well, I would say a couple of things. First of all, conservatives are interesting in the fight against LGBTQ equality because they understand that as LGBTQ people become more socially accepted, it's difficult to fight on the same turf, right? So for instance, in the HIV and AIDS crisis, gays were diseased. And so you couldn't hang around them because you might catch something, right? But as that fell away, as we understood HIV and AIDS more, that fell away as a talking point. So it became same-sex marriage, and that became, well, if we allow gays to marry each other, then the family unit falls apart, no one can procreate anymore, people will marry their dogs, all of that stuff, right? And then when that didn't really pan out, and it just turns out people loved each other and wanted, you know, to get married like anybody else, that sort of slipped away and it became transgender civil rights. That was it. It was, you know, men in dresses are going to go and scare your wife in the bathroom, and right, they sort of move around to different boogeymen depending on what is socially accepted. Right now, that appears to be transgender athletes, that they've decided this is the thing they can draw the line in the sand on, that, you know, oh, everyone can agree that gays and lesbians deserve rights, but do you really want that big burly man in a dress playing, you know, sports against your daughter? That has been the thing that they've now coalesced around to refuse to support LGBTQ civil rights. But I will say this on marriage, because I think it's important to your point. While I haven't seen a concerted effort, or at least an effective effort yet, to challenge the marriage ruling, first of all, I go back to the point that I made earlier, that it's possible. And certainly if conservative groups are hearing that there's some waffling on the Supreme Court, they're going to look at that as an opening. And there are still very problematic laws on the books. So here in the state of Florida, there is still a ban on same-sex marriage on the books. And we have lawmakers in Tallahassee, specifically, I mentioned the first out lesbian Black woman elected to the legislature. Her name is Representative Michelle Rayner. She's in the St. Pete area. She was one of our top targets to get her in, and we're really excited she's there. One of the repealer bills that she's filed is to repeal the ban on same-sex marriage in the state of Florida. So we need to see a concerted effort state by state, as we have always needed to see, to codify protections for LGBTQ people, whether it's marriage equality, whether it's non-discrimination, whether it's bans on conversion therapy. And the reason for that is exactly what you're talking about, that we've got to cut off avenues for conservative groups to continue to challenge Supreme Court rulings or elect a president who will roll back executive orders. We have to put these things in writing. We have to put them in writing on the federal level, on the state level, on the local level, so that we can lock in protections for marriage equality and civil rights for the LGBTQ community on all levels, and not leave them open to erosion like you're talking about.
Great. Are there other comments, other questions from people? You can raise your hands, or you can just indicate with physically that you have something to say. Okay, well, thank you, Brandon. This was just marvelous. This was so inspiring. And we really appreciate the work that Equality Florida is doing, and the work that you're doing.
Thank you. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me, everybody.
Thank you.
And if you, I'm sorry, I'm just going to drop this in the chat right now. If you have follow-up questions or you want to chat more, I just dropped my email address into the chat. So feel free to write me an email. It's just brandon@equalityflorida.org. Super easy. And I'd love to chat with you.
Great. And I will save those links to share at our next meeting.
Amazing. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank
Thanks so
you.
much.
Do we have a talk next week?
We do, yes. It's going to be LGBTQ affairs at the University of Florida.
Oh, okay. Affairs? Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It depends
Yeah.
upon what you know what the different meanings.
I love that. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.